we demand comprehensive action to ensure that Facebook cannot be weaponized to undermine the vote and with it American democracy.
Facebook must stop immediately all of the dangerous misinformation that is attacking our elections and promoting voter suppression.
Facebook says it has learned from past mistakes as it tries to crack down on misinformation, taking down a record number of fake accounts. But less than 2 weeks before Election Day, some criticize it for not doing enough, while others accuse it of censoring information and blocking free speech. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ghida Fakhry. In an unusual move, Facebook and Twitter censored a New York Post story about alleged emails from the Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden's son that suggested he gave a Ukrainian executive the opportunity to meet with his father. The alleged emails were said to be obtained by Rudy Giuliani, Trump's personal attorney, and his former top advisor, Steve Bannon. The Biden campaign said no such meeting took place. Facebook decided to limit access to the story in order to have it fact-checked by a third party, and Twitter marked the story as, quote, potentially unsafe, temporarily locking the accounts of the Trump campaign and the White House press secretary in what the company said was a violation of its rules on publishing hacked materials. The move triggered an immediate backlash from Republicans and conservatives who accused the social media giants of engaging in censorship and election interference. While Republicans on Capitol Hill accused Facebook and Twitter of political bias, Democrats criticized them for not being aggressive enough in cracking down on harmful posts, including election misinformation. The companies, whose CEOs will testify before Congress at the end of this month, rejected accusations of bias, saying they do not enforce their policies on the basis of political ideology. Joining us now for an in-depth look at the role of big social media companies in this election is Facebook's former director of monetization, Tim Kendall. Tim Kendall, first let me ask you if you think that Facebook overreached, that it overreacted and made a mistake with the way it handled the Hunter Biden New York Post story.
I don't think so. I think that was misinformation or potentially misinformation. And I think when there are gray area situations like that, I think Facebook needs to slow down distribution.
Hold on, but even if there was misinformation, even if the content of the story was dubious and needed to be fact-checked, this is the job of media companies, isn't it? Is it the job of social media networks to make an editorial judgment like this, essentially editing content and deciding what people should and should not know about, what they should and should not read?
Look, I think these companies are media companies. I think we've been telling ourselves for the last 24 years since we decided that these companies are not media companies and aren't going to be regulated like media companies, that there's something different. They're technology companies, but they are media companies. I mean, most people get their news and their information and their entertainment from these platforms. How is that not a media company?
But these platforms are not held liable the way media companies are. And if you look at recent surveys, you'll find that 90% of Republicans and independent-leaning Republicans in this country think it is somewhat to very likely that social media companies intentionally censor political viewpoints they find objectionable. In fact, 69% of them believe these tech companies support the views of liberals over conservatives. Doesn't this type of censorship, for the lack of a better word, play right into the hands of conservatives who believe that they have a political bias against them?
Sure, except that I think that view that conservatives take is just incorrect, and it doesn't bear out in facts. If you look at the most popular links per day at Facebook, the vast majority of them are conservative. They're getting tons of distribution. I don't believe that censorship is happening at all. And I think if you get a conservative in an objective state, they'll tell you, look, like there needs to be some oversight of these social media companies. They need to start to be held liable like a media company.
But the White House says that Facebook is hampering free speech. The press secretary, in fact, was locked out of her account for sharing that New York Post story. She said this.
They essentially have me at gunpoint and said, unless you delete a news story reported by the New York Post, I cannot regain access to my account. This is censorship. It is not the American way. This is not how a freedom-loving democracy operates. And we have told Twitter accountable, and Facebook too is banning the transmission of the story simply because ideologically it hurts the side of the aisle that Silicon Valley prefers. It's sad. It's censorship. This is not America.
The press secretary called it censorship.
Well, on one hand, the press secretary is talking about how she's got a gun to her head and there's full censorship happening. On the other hand, Trump is writing amended proposals to 230 saying, hey, we've got to get this under control. The fact that these companies have no liability around the content that's distributed is not okay.
Here's how the president, in fact, reacted to it. He tweeted, so terrible that Facebook and Twitter took down the story of smoking gun emails relating to sleepy Joe Biden and his son, Hunter, in the New York Post. It is only the beginning for them. There's nothing worse than a corrupt politician. Repeal Section 230. Now, this is part of the Communication Decency Act, which essentially spares tech companies from being held liable for what they publish on their platforms. This was passed in 1996 at a time when most of us were just learning about the internet. This was way before anyone could foresee anything like Facebook. But is Section 230 obsolete in the Facebook and Twitter era? I mean, can these companies remain immune from liability?
I don't think they can be. I don't really understand why the president wants to repeal Section 230, but he's complaining about censorship. Like in other words, he wants them to police themselves. He wants them to flag things that are false. It's a completely contradictory stance.
Talking of contradictory stances, for 5 years you led the company's advertising and product development. You told Congress last month that Facebook intentionally made its products as addictive as cigarettes. You said you worried, in fact, that the platform was contributing to extremism in the US and online tribalism in general, which you said could push the country to the brink of civil war. These are daunting claims. At which point did you realize that? And can this genie ever be put back in the bottle?
Yeah, look, I think we're in a really serious situation right now. And that situation is that we've got a business model on the part of all of these social media companies that relies on you and I spending more and more time on the platform each and every day. And when that's the objective, the only thing that they can do is basically create technologies and algorithms that suck us in more tomorrow than today. And what they find is that as they need to grow that, right? It used to, 10 years ago, the average amount of time that someone spent on social media was 12 and a half minutes. Today, it's 2.5 hours. And they're going to have to continue to grow that each and every day. And as they run out of people to add to the services, they actually need to grow the amount of attention per person even faster. And so to do that, they keep looking for new additives. And the additive du jour is misinformation, conspiracy theory, and content that polarizes us. It's good business.
You worked with the founder of Facebook, in fact, for about 4 or 5 years. He has come under relentless pressure from Democrats on the Hill for not doing more early on, certainly for not doing more after the last election. Here's what he said then.
The idea that fake news on Facebook, of which it's a very small amount of the content, influence the election in any way, I think is a pretty crazy idea.
Can you really say that fake news is a very small amount of the content on Facebook? I mean, do you trust Zuckerberg when he says this and when he later admits that there was a major breach of trust and that he was simply sorry for it?
I don't think you can say that. And he admitted basically 2 years later in front of Congress that he was wrong and that they effectively did tip the election. And I think this is the problem that I have with Facebook. I believe that the people leading Facebook are negligent, and they're negligent because they don't understand the impact that their platform is having. They're behind. And the 2016 election is a great example. Right after the election, Mark Zuckerberg asserted that it was crazy. And then 2 years later, he basically, with contrition, admits that they got it wrong, probably did tip the election, and look, I'm sorry. So what's going to happen in 2022, 2 years after today? What are they going to realize that they are doing today in terms of disrupting democracy? So my big concern is that they just don't really understand what they have on their hands, and it's creating all kinds of damage and harms, and they don't have their arms fully around it.
They don't understand, or they are not willing to admit this? And to what extent do you pin all of this blame on Zuckerberg himself? Because many people will argue that this is a private company run by one man.
I mean, I don't know what his intention is. I mean, I can't read his mind, but it doesn't really matter whether they don't understand or whether they're willfully denying it. The outcome is the same, which is that we've got really serious problems on our hands. And I think that ultimately the government is just going to have to hold him accountable to some of the harms that he's creating. You look at fossil fuel companies, you know, when there started to be serious impacts on the environment, the way that we got fossil fuel companies to shape up is we started charging them for the harms that they created. Facebook has no incentive right now, at least financially, because they're not liable for any of the harms. And I think that has to change.
But it's a very wide network that and platform that Facebook has created in hundreds of languages in a multitude of countries. Can you actually police this wide network and hold people accountable for what they post or don't post on this network? I mean, Facebook now said that it's completely banned the conspiracy group QAnon across all of its platforms, labeling
after years
of activists asking for that, but they now label it as a militarized social movement. It recently said it's also removing more than 275 accounts with suspected fake profiles of people pretending to be right-leaning Americans supporting President Trump. But there are probably millions of fake accounts of troll farms throughout the world. So is Facebook really serious about all this? Can it do very much about it, or has it simply created a monster that it cannot control?
Well, I think it's created a monster, and I think it also has tremendous resources that it can bring to bear to fight a lot of these things. And there's a lot of talent within that company. So if the incentives are there, I think they can absolutely do it. I think the other thing that needs to happen over the medium and long term is that I think that the government and the consumers need to put pressure on Facebook to shift their business model. And this is not unlike how, you know, auto companies that were reliant on fossil fuels have been forced through regulation and incentives to switch over to cleaner technologies, cleaner energy technologies. In the same way, I think that Facebook, consumers, and governments need to work together to figure out how do we get off this extractive, pernicious business model of advertising and onto a business model that really aligns Facebook's interests with the user's interest and well-being. That's where we have to go.
Tim Kendall, great to have you on the program. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Now, criticism of Facebook over content accountability isn't new. Activists have been calling for years on the company to take action against individuals and groups promoting intolerance, racism, and misinformation. To quell the mounting criticism, the company announced last May that it would establish its own oversight board with an initial 20 board members, including a former Republican US federal judge, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate from Yemen, and a former Danish prime minister. It made a commitment to, quote, uphold freedom of expression within the framework of international norms of human rights and take final and binding decisions on whether specific content should be allowed or removed from its platforms.
Board members cannot be Facebook employees or government officials and cannot be removed or terminated by Facebook. They will be contracted and paid through an independent trust and will have their own separate staff. The board will decide which cases to review, concentrating on the challenges with the widest impact and greatest public interest. It will then share and explain its decisions.
Now, while Facebook has committed to accepting those decisions and making them public, the board is still not operational. Critics who are tired of waiting have started their own board. They call it the Real Facebook Oversight Board. It consists of a group of about 25 experts, academics, civil rights activists, politicians, and journalists. They held their first live meeting on October 1st and pledged to critique the social media giant's content decisions in the lead up to the US election. So will this independent oversight board be able to hold Facebook to account? Should any social media company be in a position to wield this much power around the world with no system of checks and balances? Let's put this in focus with a member of the real Facebook Oversight Board, Toomas Hendrik Ilves, who served as president of Estonia from 2006 to 2016. President Ilves, for the real Facebook Oversight Board, Facebook is seen as a weapon that is subverting democracy. It's a grave accusation. How do you take on such a giant tech company and succeed in reining it in? Because in the end, it's not just Facebook, is it, but the technology that it has pioneered and that is also used by others that is at stake.
The absence of any genuine oversight of what they post has clearly manipulated elections and moved them, well, we know that fake stories are spread and shared far more than the more boring true stories. And we've seen sort of fake stories spread like wildfire. And we've seen manipulation on the part of the IRA, or Internet Research Agency, a Russian troll farm, of posts on Facebook. So all of this has clearly had some kind of effect on the political culture.
But it has, though. I mean, and you mentioned that fake stories spread and travel like wildfire, and they do. In fact, there's a recent MIT study that shows that fake news stories are 70% more likely to be reshared than real factual stories. But the bottom line is this: none of your board's decisions will in the end ultimately be binding on Facebook. So how do you rein in a company like this? It's a private company that it is essentially controlled by one man. How do you convince the CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, to do the right thing?
Clearly, I mean, this is a kind of a civil society action, since we see that self-regulation, self-policing has not worked. We have one scandal after another, from basically the Myanmar army attacking Rohingya, to all kinds of other manipulations. But if no one raises this, or if it is raised in an academic paper, it doesn't really get the kind of coverage that it needs to at least name and shame the company. They are not doing this by themselves or on their own. They have some efforts on finding fake news and eliminating them, but it really is completely inadequate.
But so they say they've done a few things, though. They say they've already taken measures in the lead up to the US election to clamp down on voter misinformation. It's free speech in the end, they say, isn't it?
Well, it's a private company. Free speech is about what you can do and not do in a society, and not be and not have the state come down on you for your free speech. This is a private company making money. So we know this has been going on. I mean, already in the previous 2016 election, you saw that there were about, there were, 2.3 million fake stories shared and 1.4 million real stories shared. And this is, and as you mentioned, the statistic recently, that continues. The main effort is that to name and shame. I mean, you have a number of prominent people on this board who can make noise, from Kara Swisher to well, I don't know, Roger McNamee. I mean, these are people who are listened to and who are authoritative.
But you mentioned that it's a profit-making enterprise, and Facebook is actually currently valued at more than $744 billion. That's larger than the GDP of Austria, which is about 440 billion, larger than Ireland's GDP, or Sweden's, or Switzerland's. In fact, it's 24 times the GDP of Estonia. But it isn't just Facebook. Again, Twitter has a far smaller market capitalization, but it can also be accused of misuse and undermining democracy, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the position, my position at least, is if you have so much money, then you can really afford to spend some of that money on clamping down on disinformation, which is really I mean, otherwise, if people want to talk to each other on Facebook, there's no problem with that. What we are concerned with is the undermining of democracy, and that's really what counts. And we have to take into account that this is we are facing an asymmetric problem. You cannot change the results of an election in an authoritarian country. There is no way the United States is going to be able to manipulate the elections in Russia because they don't have democratic elections. We do. So we are far more vulnerable and asymmetrically vulnerable.
I mean, what Russia is accused of doing today, many others may have been doing for years.
There is enough manipulation going on domestically, but when you have a concerted effort on the part of a state, and we've documented it, having fake Facebook pages calling for anti-Islamic or anti-Muslim demonstrations at the same time in place as pro-Muslim tolerance demonstrations, as happened in Texas a few years ago, all from the same place, all in the hope of causing a disturbance.
So what is the solution? I know your country, Estonia, was the target in 2007 of a wave of cyber attacks on the servers of the government, banks and news organizations. In fact, the capital, Tallinn, is home to NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center. You have been saying for a couple of years now that the world needs a coalition of liberal democracies, a cyber NATO for the digital age. But it seems to be a narrow view of the problem, isn't it?
Well, I mean, that mainly has to do with the problem of each country trying to do it on its own. I mean, it's hardly one solution, but if you have the same group, say the same hacking groups, APT 28 and 29, attacking the Bundestag, the US Congress, the Italian foreign minister, even the World Anti-Doping Agency, each country taking a strictly national approach without sharing information really means that we're in bad shape. Whereas if we can start, on the basis of mutual cooperation, as the way NATO works, but it's not NATO, but something like that, we can share information and take concerted action.
But again, does this suggest that only the intelligence agencies of Western democracies are the ones that do not misuse the internet and social media? Is there some kind of implicit suggestion there by creating a cyber NATO?
No, well, I think the implicit suggestion is that if you're a liberal democracy, you have a full right to join. I mean, NATO is is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is based on geography. Our point is that, or my point is that we should have democracies wherever they happen to be.
But do you agree that others are also doing what the Russians are being accused of?
Yes, I know. I mean,
including Western democracies.
Deal with Iranian disinformation, which recently, for example, targeted the UK. I mean, it's not an anti-Russian organization. It's an would be an anti-disinformation coalition of democracies.
But there's also the Stuxnet. Remember the Stuxnet incident, the world's first digital weapon that was used against Iran's nuclear installations. Right. That was a major cyber attack on Iran's nuclear installations back then.
I don't think that was right. I mean, I've never thought that was right. I think that it was a disastrous move, having hostile actions in cyberspace.
All right, President Toomas, Hendrik, Ilves, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Sure.
The head of Facebook may not be on the ballot, but his company, as well as Twitter, are omnipresent in this critical and tumultuous 2020 US election. The accusations against Facebook for what US intelligence agencies say were Russian cyber attacks on the 2016 election remain on the agenda. This puts more pressure on social media platforms to police content that they, willfully or not, propagate. The problem has become critical for the United States with the resurgence of white supremacist groups and other right-wing organizations and conspiracy movements like QAnon, which sprung out of nowhere and established itself on the political landscape virtually overnight. Legislators in the US in particular are aware of the dangers these platforms pose to national security, social cohesion, to their own democracy, but they seem to be at a loss. Taking on cyber giants such as Facebook, Twitter, or Google is no easy feat. Push too hard and you'll face their financial wherewithal and angry proponents of freedom of speech. Don't push hard enough and you'll allow these corporations to have an even deeper grip over our lives with their addictive algorithms and business models that not only impact elections in the US and elsewhere, but shape the minds of upcoming generations raised with or by social media. So in short, it is beyond doubt that Facebook and others will have a serious impact on the 2020 US presidential election, an invisible hand of sorts that both campaigns criticize but take full advantage of as a cost-effective way to reach voters. In the end, these platforms have one aim: to use to monetize each consumer, young and old, as their product, to consume, to buy, to think, and to vote. And they keep getting better at it as they try to get us, and worse, our children, addicted. We'd love to hear what you think. For now, though, from me and the team here in Washington, thanks for watching.